The temperature outside was dropping rapidly below zero, and 72-year-old Thomas could barely feel his hands as he clutched the eviction notice signed by his own son. After decades of hard work, he and his wife had been tossed into the street, stripped of their family home, their dignity, and their life savings. But as they drove blindly into a raging blizzard toward a dilapidated inheritance they hadn't even known existed, they couldn't possibly imagine what awaited them. Buried beneath a century of dust, behind a frozen iron door in the attic of a snowed-in mansion, lay a secret that would turn their devastating betrayal into a $265 million revenge. The morning it all fell apart began like any other in the Brookline, Massachusetts home where Thomas and Margaret Sterling had lived for 42 years. The smell of cinnamon and freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen. At 70, Margaret still moved with a quiet, practiced grace, though arthritis had begun to claim the knuckles of her hands. Thomas, 2 years her senior, sat at the oak dining table, the very table he had built himself in 1984, reading the morning paper. They had built a good life. It hadn't been an opulent one, but it was sturdy. Thomas had run a mid-sized commercial plumbing business, and Margaret had been a high school literature teacher. They had poured everything they had into their only child, Richard. Private schools, a degree from an Ivy League university, and the seed money for his own wealth management firm in downtown Boston. Then came the knock on the door. It wasn't the polite, familiar knock of a neighbor. It was sharp, authoritative, and impatient. When Thomas opened the door, the crisp November wind blew into the hallway, bringing with it their son, Richard, his impeccably dressed wife, Beatrice, and a man in a charcoal suit clutching a leather briefcase. "Richard? Beatrice?" Thomas asked, stepping back in surprise. "We weren't expecting you. Come in. It's freezing." Richard didn't take off his coat. He stepped into the foyer, his eyes darting around the house with a cold, calculating detachment. Beatrice stood behind him, checking her phone, her designer handbag clutched tightly to her chest as if she feared the middle-class air might contaminate it. "We can't stay, Dad," Richard said, his voice clipped. "This is David Brentwood. He's the attorney handling the restructuring of the Sterling Family Trust." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the hallway, a warm smile faltering on her face. "Restructuring? What does that mean, sweetheart?" 14 months prior, Thomas had suffered a mild ischemic stroke. It had scared them all. While Thomas was in the hospital recovering, Richard had swooped in, playing the role of the devoted, concerned son. He had convinced his parents that to protect their assets from potential long-term medical care and exorbitant taxes, they needed to sign over the deed to the Brookline house and grant him a durable power of attorney. They had trusted him implicitly. He was a financial advisor. He was their son. Why wouldn't they? Mr. Brentwood, the lawyer, opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of manila folders. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, as the sole trustee and legal owner of the property under the irrevocable trust established last year, your son has finalized the sale of this estate." Thomas froze. The silence in the hallway was sudden and absolute. "The sale? Richard, what is he talking about?" Richard finally looked his father in the eye, though there was no warmth in his gaze, only a ruthless pragmatism. "I'm liquidating the asset, Dad. The real estate market in Brookline is peaking. The firm is expanding into commercial acquisitions, and I need the capital. The closing is on Friday." "You sold our house?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. She reached out, gripping the edge of the hallway console table to steady herself. "Richard, where are we supposed to go? This is our home. It's a house, Mom. And frankly, it's too big for you two anyway." Richard sighed, as if explaining a simple math problem to a slow child. "I've secured you a spot at the Whispering Pines Assisted Living Facility in Lynn. The state subsidies will cover most of it, and I'll supplement the rest. It's practical." Thomas's face flushed a deep, dangerous crimson. The realization of what had happened hit him like a physical blow. The paperwork in the hospital. The dense legal jargon. His son hadn't protected them. He had legally robbed them blind. "You stole our home to fund your business," Thomas stated, his voice trembling with a terrifying, quiet rage. "I leveraged an underutilized asset," Richard corrected smoothly. "You signed the documents, Dad. It's done. The new owners are tearing it down to build a multifamily complex. You have 72 hours to vacate." Beatrice finally looked up from her phone. "Honestly, Margaret, you should be thanking us. You don't have to clean this drafty old place anymore. The movers will be here Wednesday. Don't try to take the fixtures they convey with the sale." Without another word, Richard handed his father a bank check for $5,000, a pitiful, insulting fraction of the home's worth, and turned on his heel. The door clicked shut, leaving Thomas and Margaret standing in the ruins of their life. For 2 days, they packed in a daze. Margaret wept silently over boxes of old photographs, while Thomas made desperate, frantic calls to legal aid. Every lawyer told him the same thing. Richard's paperwork was ironclad. They had signed away their rights willingly. On the third day, as they were loading the last of their clothes into their aging 2005 Subaru Outback, the mail carrier handed Thomas a final stack of forwarded mail. Mixed among the utility bills they no longer had to pay was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the return address of a law firm in Albany, Caldwell and Vance Associates. Thomas tore it open. It was a letter from an executor regarding the estate of Theodore Ashford. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked at the name. Uncle Teddy? I haven't seen him since I was 10 years old. He was the black sheep of my mother's family. A total eccentric. The letter was brief. Theodore Ashford had passed away at the age of 94. As his last living blood relative, Margaret had inherited his sole remaining asset, a property listed simply as Blackwood in the remote Adirondack Mountains, near Saranac Lake. The deed was enclosed. They looked at each other, the same desperate thought passing between them. They couldn't stomach the idea of living in a state-run facility under Richard's thumb. They had $5,000, a car full of clothes, and a piece of paper claiming they owned a property in upstate New York. It's probably a hunting cabin, Thomas said, his breath pluming in the freezing November air. A cabin is better than a cage, Margaret replied, her voice hardening with a newfound resolve. They didn't tell Richard where they were going. They simply got in the Subaru, turned the heater on high, and drove north into the gathering storm. By the time they crossed the state line into New York, the sky had turned the color of bruised iron. A massive nor'easter, early for the season but devastating in its intensity, was sweeping across the mountains. The radio crackled with emergency broadcast warnings, urging all drivers to stay off the roads. But Thomas couldn't stop. They had nowhere to stop. Hotel rooms would eat into their meager $5,000, and every mile they put between themselves and Boston felt like a tiny victory against their son's betrayal. The roads grew treacherous as they passed through Saranac Lake. The GPS signal died, leaving them reliant on the crude, hand-drawn map included in the lawyer's envelope. They turned off the plowed highway onto a winding, ascending county road enveloped by dense, skeletal pine trees. Snow whipped across the windshield in hypnotic, blinding sheets. The Subaru's tires spun and gripped, fighting for traction on the accumulating ice. "Are you sure this is the right way, Tom?" Margaret asked, clutching the dashboard, her knuckles white. "It has to be," Thomas muttered, leaning forward, his eyes straining against the whiteout conditions. "The map says 3 miles past the old lumber mill. That was 2 miles ago." The road narrowed until it was little more than a trail through the dark, encroaching forest. Just as the car's radiator began to hiss in protest, the headlights cut through the swirling snow to reveal a pair of massive, wrought iron gates, rusted shut and chained. Stone pillars flanking the gates bore tarnished brass plaques. Blackwood, Thomas forced the car into park, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stepped out into the biting wind, the cold slicing through his heavy wool coat instantly. With a heavy tire iron from the trunk, he struck the old, brittle padlock on the gates. It snapped after 3 heavy blows. He drove the car through, the tires crunching over snow-buried gravel. The driveway wound upward for another half-mile before the trees suddenly broke, revealing their inheritance. Margaret gasped. It wasn't a hunting cabin. Looming against the dark, stormy sky was a sprawling 3-story stone mansion. It was a relic of the Gilded Age, complete with slate turrets, Gothic archways, and a massive wraparound porch. But it was a dead house. The windows were pitch black, and the entire structure seemed to be sagging under the weight of decades of neglect and fresh snow. It looked less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum. "Good Lord," Thomas whispered. They parked near the front steps, grabbed their emergency flashlights, and approached the heavy oak front doors. The key the lawyer had sent turned stubbornly in the oxidized lock. With a heavy shove, Thomas forced the door open. The air inside was stale, smelling of dry rot, dust, and freezing stone. It was colder inside the mansion than it was outside. The flashlight beams swept across a cavernous grand foyer. A sweeping mahogany staircase ascended into the darkness. Heavy canvas tarps covered the furniture, making the grand room look like it was filled with gray ghosts. Thomas found a light switch and flicked it. Nothing. The power had likely been disconnected for years. "We can't survive the night in here, Tom," Margaret said, her teeth chattering violently. "It's a freezer." Survival instinct, honed by years of hard labor before his business took off, kicked into gear for Thomas. "We just need one room. A fire. We need to find a fireplace." They pushed through a set of double doors into what appeared to be a library. The walls were lined with decaying books, but more importantly, a massive stone hearth dominated the far wall. Thomas didn't hesitate. He grabbed a delicate, antique wooden side chair, raised it above his head, and smashed it against the stone floor. It splintered into perfect kindling. Using old newspapers found in a desk and a lighter from his glove box, Thomas managed to coax a fire to life. The dry-aged wood caught quickly, throwing a warm, flickering orange glow into the cavernous room. They dragged a dusty mattress down from a second-floor bedroom, huddled under every blanket they had brought from Boston, and spent their first night in Blackwood Manor listening to the wind howl and scream against the heavy stone walls. When morning broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind a blinding, pristine silence. The snow had drifted halfway up the first-floor windows. They were completely snowed in, miles from civilization. While Margaret melted snow in a tarnished silver pot over the dying embers to make instant coffee, Thomas set out to explore the rest of their bizarre inheritance. The house was a labyrinth of the past. Theodore Ashford had clearly been a hoarder of high-end antiquities. Rooms were piled high with Persian rugs, grandfather clocks, and crates of old china. But everything was ruined by moisture, time, and mice. There was nothing of immediate liquid value, certainly nothing that could buy them their life back. Thomas climbed to the second floor, his boots echoing in the empty halls. Then, he noticed a narrow, secondary staircase tucked behind a linen closet, leading up to the third floor and the attic. As he climbed higher, the air grew noticeably colder. There was a draft, sharp and biting. He reached the top landing, expecting to find standard wooden attic doors. Instead, his flashlight beam reflected off solid metal. Thomas stopped, frowning. Built directly into the framing of the old Victorian house was a heavy, reinforced steel door. It looked like the door to a bank vault, entirely out of place among the peeling wallpaper and decaying wood. There was no keyhole. Instead, bolted to the center of the steel plate was a heavy, mechanical rotary combination dial, slightly rusted but still intact. Thomas placed his gloved hand on the cold steel. It didn't budge a millimeter. Why would an eccentric old man put a bank vault door on an attic in a remote mountain mansion? Thomas stared at the dial, the gears in his head turning faster than they had in years. He didn't know the combination. He didn't know what was inside. But as he stood in the freezing dark, a strange, electric feeling washed over him. A sudden, absolute certainty that whatever his uncle had locked away up here, it was the reason they had been brought to Blackwood Manor. For 3 agonizing days, the blizzard battered Blackwood Manor, effectively burying the first-floor windows behind a wall of impenetrable white. Inside, the grand, decaying house became a battleground for survival. Thomas and Margaret rationed the pathetic stockpile of food they had thrown into the Subaru, 2 boxes of granola bars, a half-empty jar of peanut butter, and 4 cans of condensed tomato soup. They melted snow in the library fireplace, sleeping on the floor, their bodies pressed together beneath a mountain of dusty, moth-eaten tapestries just to keep their blood moving. Every morning, the freezing temperature served as a harsh reminder of their son's betrayal. Richard was likely sitting in his climate-controlled Boston office right now, finalizing the demolition of their family home. Completely unbothered by the fact that he had left his parents to freeze in the wilderness, the thought kindled a dark, stubborn fire in Thomas's chest. He refused to die in this house. While Margaret tended to the hearth and boiled their drinking water, Thomas became consumed by the anomaly on the 3rd floor. Armed with a rusted crowbar and a heavy ball-peen hammer he had salvaged from the Manor's collapsed carriage house, Thomas assaulted the steel door. He spent hours striking the heavy hinges, trying to wedge the crowbar into the microscopic seam between the door and the reinforced frame. But the vault was a fortress. It was a mid-century Mosler safe door, the kind used in Federal Reserve banks, engineered to withstand dynamite and drill bits. His tools only left superficial scratches on the icy steel. Exhausted, his breath pluming in the freezing attic air, Thomas slid down the wall and stared at the heavy rotary dial. It was a Sargent and Greenleaf manipulation-proof lock. Without the exact numerical sequence, the door would remain sealed until the end of time. Downstairs, Margaret was waging her own war against the house. In her desperate search for dry, burnable wood, she had begun breaking down the ornate mahogany furniture in Theodore Ashford's expansive study. While dismantling a heavy, roll-top desk, a false panel in the back gave way, spilling a cascade of leather-bound ledgers and brittle, yellowed documents onto the floor. That evening, by the flickering light of their survival fire, Margaret began to read. Theodore Ashford had not just been an eccentric recluse. He had been a phantom titan of mid-century industry. The ledgers detailed his life beginning in the late 1940s. He had been an early, silent financial backer for a man named Harrison Sterling, a name that made Thomas drop his tin cup of soup. Sterling? Thomas echoed, leaning closer to the fire. Are you sure? Like my grandfather? Margaret traced the faded ink with a trembling finger. It says Harrison Sterling. Your grandfather's brother, Tom. Your great-uncle. Theodore was in business with him. The revelation was staggering. According to the diaries, Theodore Ashford and Harrison Sterling had secured a patent in 1953 for a revolutionary localized pressure valve system used in early commercial aviation and deep-sea drilling. It was a foundational piece of engineering. But Harrison had been ruthless. He had legally maneuvered Theodore out of the company just before taking it public, hoarding the immense profits and leaving Theodore with a fraction of what he was owed. Theodore's journals descended into a dark, consuming paranoia after the betrayal. Convinced that banks, governments, and former partners were constantly conspiring to steal his remaining wealth, he began liquidating every asset he had. He purchased Blackwood Manor in 1961, retreating from society completely. He converted his millions into untraceable physical assets. Gold bullion, rare bearer bonds, and offshore Swiss accounts. He brought it all here, Margaret whispered, looking up at the ceiling, toward the attic. He didn't trust banks. He locked it all away. To keep it safe from the Sterlings, Thomas felt a bitter, ironic laugh claw its way out of his throat. A Sterling had ruined Theodore Ashford, driving him into paranoid isolation. And now, decades later, another Sterling, their own son, Richard, had ruined them, driving them directly to the fortune Theodore had hidden away. Is there a combination in those books, Maggie? Thomas asked, his voice suddenly thick with desperation. A sequence? A date? Margaret shook her head. It's not that simple. He was paranoid. He wouldn't just write it down, but he kept repeating a phrase in his later entries, over and over again. She flipped to the very last page of the final journal, dated November 1998, just months before Theodore was believed to have passed away. The debt is measured in the days of my exile. From the moment the gavel fell to the day I sealed the iron. Day 4 arrived with a brilliant, blinding sunshine that reflected off the 6 feet of snow burying the estate. The storm had passed, but they were entirely trapped. Their food was gone. The cold was beginning to seep into their bones, bringing a dangerous, lethargic, heavy-headedness that Thomas knew preceded hypothermia. They had to open the door today. There was no tomorrow. They dragged themselves up the narrow stairs to the freezing attic. Margaret held the flashlight with trembling, frostbitten hands while Thomas knelt before the Mosler vault door, his fingers stiff and clumsy on the cold brass dial. Read it again, Maggie, Thomas rasped. The debt is measured in the days of my exile. From the moment the gavel fell to the day I sealed the iron. Margaret recited, her voice weak but steady. The gavel, Thomas muttered, his mind racing. The lawsuit. When did Harrison Sterling legally force him out? Margaret fumbled with the ledgers she had brought upstairs. She flipped through the brittle pages, her eyes scanning the dates. Here. The court ruling was finalized on the 14th of October, 1955. Okay. Now, when did he seal the iron? When was this vault installed? Margaret searched frantically. Theodore's entries about the manor's renovations were erratic, filled with complaints about the contractors he had hired and fired from Saranac Lake to maintain his secrecy. Finally, she found an entry underlined 3 times in furious black ink. The Mosler Company finished the installation. He dismissed the workers and locked the mechanism on the 2nd of December, 1961. Thomas closed his eyes, his mind working through the math. He had run a business for 40 years, calculating timelines was second nature. The 14th of October 1955 to the 2nd of December 1961. That's 6 years. 6 non-leap years is 2,190 days, plus the days in October, November, and the 2 in December. Maggie, figure out the exact number of days. Using the blank back page of the ledger and a pencil stump, Margaret calculated furiously. 2,241 days. 2,241. Thomas stared at the dial. Standard combination locks usually required 3 numbers, alternating directions. But a 4-digit sequence? Wait, Thomas said. Look at the dial. It goes from 0 to 99. He placed his hand on the dial. He spun it to the right, clearing the mechanism. Okay, let's try it as pairs. 22, 41. He turned the dial right, stopping precisely on 22. Then he turned it left, passing 22 once and stopping on 41. He grasped the heavy, polished steel lever handle. He pulled. The door remained absolutely immovable. Thomas let out a ragged breath, slamming his fist against the steel. It's wrong. It's too simple. We're missing something. Margaret stared at the ledger, a tear escaping her eye and freezing on her cheek. He hated the Sterlings, Tom. He hated your family for what they did to him. Why would he leave this to me? I'm his blood. Yes, but I married a Sterling. Thomas froze. He looked at his wife. Because you're the only one who isn't a Sterling by blood. You're an Ashford. He knew we were married. Maybe the combination isn't just about his exile. It's about his revenge. Margaret wiped her face. What do you mean? The phrase again, Maggie. Exactly as it's written. The debt is measured in the days of my exile. She paused, squinting at the page. Wait, there's a smudge here. I thought it was just water damage, but it's a minus sign. The debt is measured in the days of my exile, minus the blood. Minus the blood, Thomas repeated. He was a genetic fanatic. The bloodline. How many letters are in the name Sterling? 8. And Ashford? 7. Thomas took a deep breath. 2,241 days of exile, minus the blood, minus the Sterlings, minus 8. 2,233, Margaret whispered. Thomas cleared the dial again. He spun it right, stopping on 22. He turned it left, past 22, stopping precisely on 33. Then, on a gut instinct, he turned it right again, back to 0, engaging the final pin. A heavy, metallic clack echoed through the silent attic. It sounded like a gunshot. Thomas grasped the heavy steel handle. He planted his boots against the floor and pulled with every ounce of strength he had left in his 72-year-old body. The massive Mosler door groaned, the heavy hinges screaming in protest as they moved for the first time in over 6 decades. A rush of stale, vacuum-sealed air washed over them. Thomas and Margaret stumbled forward, shining the flashlight into the darkness of the vault. It wasn't a room filled with dusty antiques. It was a pristine, climate-controlled space lined with stainless steel industrial shelving. On the left side of the room, stacked with mathematical precision, were wooden crates stamped with the insignia of the Zurich Federal Bank. Thomas pried the lid off the nearest crate. Inside, resting in custom-cut velvet, were dozens of heavy, rectangular bricks. The flashlight beam hit them, reflecting a warm, heavy yellow luster. Solid gold bullion, dozens of crates of it. But the real shock lay on the right side of the vault. Neatly arranged in waterproof, fireproof lockboxes were stacks of U.S. Treasury bearer bonds from the 1950s, pieces of paper that functioned as pure cash to whoever physically held them, long since matured and worth tens of millions. Beside them sat a series of black leather portfolios containing the account numbers, routing codes, and legal transfer documents for 3 numbered accounts at the Banque Privée Espirito Santo in Switzerland. Laying on top of the central portfolio was a single, crisp white envelope addressed simply to the last Ashford. Margaret opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a certified letter from Theodore, confirming the total liquidated value of his hidden estate at the time of its sealing, adjusting for the projected maturity of the bonds and the compound interest of the offshore accounts. The final printed number at the bottom of the page seemed to burn into the paper. Liang Yi Lo Qian Wu Bai Sisha Wu Wen Meiyan. Thomas stood in the center of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than he could have ever conceived. He looked at his hands, calloused from decades of plumbing, and then thought of his son, Richard, who had stolen a $500,000 house and left them to die. A slow, terrifyingly calm smile spread across Thomas's face. They weren't just going to survive the winter, they were going to buy back their lives, and then they were going to destroy Richard Sterling's world. On the afternoon of the 6th day, the distant, mechanical groan of a county snowplow echoed through the frozen valley. Thomas and Margaret had survived on a single can of tomato soup and melted ice for 48 hours, their bodies pushed to the absolute brink. But the discovery in the vault had ignited a profound, unnatural adrenaline in their veins. They were no longer victims waiting to freeze to death, they were the custodians of an empire. Before descending from the attic, Thomas packed 2 heavy, canvas duffel bags found rotting in a downstairs closet with a meticulously counted fortune. He took 20 of the $100,000 Series US. Treasury bearer bonds, their attached interest coupons untouched since 1961, and precisely 4 solid gold bricks. They locked the heavy Mosler door, spinning the dial back into the safety of ignorance, and carefully wiped away their footprints. When the plow finally cleared the access road to the Blackwood gates, Thomas put the Subaru in 4-wheel drive and battered through the remaining snowdrifts. They didn't look back. They didn't stop in Saranac Lake. They drove straight south, down the New York State Thruway, their heater blasting, a literal king's ransom sitting in the footwell beneath Margaret's muddy boots. Their destination was Manhattan. Thomas knew that walking into a local branch bank with mid-century bearer bonds would trigger a chaotic IRS investigation and a police response. They needed the upper echelon of the financial world, a place where extreme, sudden wealth was handled with discretion. 24 hours later, wearing clothes they had bought at a strip mall in Albany, Thomas and Margaret walked into the towering glass and steel headquarters of UBS Wealth Management Americas on the Avenue of the Americas. They looked like 2 exhausted, displaced retirees. The polished receptionist in the lobby almost turned them away, assuming they were lost. "I need to speak with a senior managing director," Thomas said, his voice raspy, but carrying a sudden, ironclad authority. "Tell them I am holding $20 million in uncashed federal bearer bonds, and I am looking for a primary banking institution." Within 10 minutes, they were sitting in a soundproof, mahogany-paneled conference room on the 42nd floor. Jonathan Hayes, a senior vice president of private wealth management, sat across from them, flanked by 2 forensic financial authenticators. Hayes, a man who regularly dealt with tech billionaires and oil tycoons, maintained a polite skepticism until Thomas unzipped the canvas duffel bag and slid a stack of the crisp, vintage bonds across the table. The authenticators examined the watermarks, the serial numbers, and the intaglio printing with illuminated magnifying loupes. After 20 agonizing minutes of silence, the lead authenticator looked up, his face pale. "Mr. Hayes, they are pristine, and they are fully matured. With compound interest, the face value of this stack alone exceeds $24 million. Hayes took a slow breath, adjusting his silk tie. He looked at the elderly couple. His demeanor entirely shifted from polite dismissal to absolute reverence. "Mr. and Mrs. Sterling, how can UBS be of service to you today?" "First," Thomas said, leaning forward, "we need a secure, armored extraction team, Gardaworld or Brinks Global Services. I have an estate in the Adirondacks containing another $240 million in physical assets and offshore routing documents. It needs to be moved to a private, climate-controlled vault in this city by midnight tomorrow. No local police, no noise. Consider it done." Hayes nodded, taking frantic notes. "Second," Margaret spoke up, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the sterile air of the boardroom. "We need to establish a blind trust in a holding corporation. It will be named Blackwood Capital Partners. The ownership must be buried under so many corporate veils and non-disclosure agreements that the devil himself couldn't find our names on it." Over the next 3 weeks, Blackwood Capital Partners was born in the shadows of international finance. The physical gold was quietly liquidated through private European buyers, and the offshore Swiss accounts were legally repatriated through a labyrinth of shell companies based in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. After taxes and the exorbitant legal fees required to maintain their absolute anonymity, Thomas and Margaret sat in a $15,000 a night penthouse suite at the Pierre Hotel overlooking Central Park, staring at a verified account balance of $182 million in liquid cash. They received premium medical care. Thomas's stroke recovery was monitored by the top neurologists at Mount Sinai. Margaret traded her worn cardigans for tailored cashmere, but they didn't buy yachts, and they didn't take vacations. Every ounce of their energy, and every dollar of their new fortune, was funneled into a single, terrifyingly focused objective. Sitting at a massive marble dining table, looking at a digital dossier compiled by a private intelligence firm they had retained, Thomas tapped the screen. The dossier was entirely focused on their son, Richard, and his company, Sterling Wealth Management. "He tore it down," Margaret whispered. looking at a satellite image of their old address in Brookline. Where their beautiful, hand-built home had once stood, there was now a massive, muddy excavation pit surrounded by chain-link fences. He did. Thomas agreed, his voice devoid of emotion. And according to this financial teardown, Richard has overextended himself to do it. The intelligence report painted a picture of a man drowning in his own ambition. Richard had leveraged his entire firm to secure a $35 million construction loan for the luxury condo project in Brookline. But supply chain shortages and skyrocketing labor costs had stalled the build. Worse, his wife, Beatrice, was bleeding his personal accounts dry with luxury renovations on their Weston mansion and exorbitant country club fees. Richard was desperate. He was actively seeking a massive influx of capital, a mezzanine bridge loan to save his company from defaulting on the initial banknotes. Traditional lenders were rejecting him. He was a wounded animal bleeding in the water. Thomas looked at Margaret. The soft, forgiving mother he had known for 40 years was gone, replaced by a woman forged in the freezing dark of an attic. "It's time," Margaret said coldly. "Let's throw him an anvil." Richard Sterling sat in his corner office overlooking Boston Harbor, sweating through his custom-tailored Tom Ford suit. He slammed his phone down onto his glass desk, the crack of plastic echoing in the quiet room. "Another pass?" Beatrice asked from the leather sofa, barely looking up from a magazine. "Bank of America says our debt-to-equity ratio is too toxic," Richard snapped, rubbing his temples. "If we don't secure $20 million by the end of the month, the Brookline site goes into foreclosure. If that happens, the cross-collateralization clauses trigger. The bank will seize this firm, they'll take the house in Weston, Beatrice, everything." "Well, fix it, Richard. That's what you do," she replied dismissively. "You can't expect me to cancel the Winter Gala just because you mismanaged a construction site." Before Richard could scream at his wife, his office intercom buzzed. It was his secretary, her voice trembling slightly. "Mr. Sterling, there is a gentleman here to see you. He says he has an appointment. A Mr. Gregory Pierce, representing Blackwood Capital Partners." Richard frowned, pulling up his calendar. There was no appointment. But in his desperate state, the words Capital Partners were a lifeline. Send him in. Gregory Pierce walked into the office like a man who owned the building. Hired exclusively by Thomas and Margaret through their UBS proxy, Pierce was a high-stakes corporate shark, heavily compensated to play a specific, ruthless role. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Richard's car, and he carried a single, slim leather portfolio. "Mr. Pierce." Richard stood, extending a hand. "I wasn't expecting you." Pierce didn't shake his hand. He simply sat in the chair opposite the desk, crossed his legs, and opened the portfolio. "I'll be brief, Mr. Sterling. My principals, who remain strictly anonymous, specialize in distressed, high-yield debt acquisitions. We are aware of your catastrophic liquidity crisis regarding the Brookline development." Richard bristled, his ego flaring. "Catastrophic is a strong word. We are experiencing a temporary cash flow bottleneck due to macroeconomic factors." "You are defaulting in 17 days, Pierce corrected flatly. "Your firm is bleeding out. However, my principals are interested in the geographic footprint of your project. I am authorized to offer you a $40 million mezzanine loan. It will cover your immediate debts, fund the construction to completion, and leave you with a comfortable operating runway." Richard's heart hammered against his ribs. $40 million. It was salvation. It was a miracle. That is precisely the injection we need. "What are the terms?" Pierce slid a thick contract across the desk. "The interest rate is 19%. But more importantly, this is a hard money, highly collateralized bridge. The collateral is a 100% equity pledge of Sterling Wealth Management, the deed to the Brookline development, and a personal, unshielded guarantee tied to your primary residence in Weston." Richard stared at the paper. "You want me to bet my entire life on one loan? If I miss a single payment, you take everything." "If you don't sign it," Pierce said smoothly, closing his portfolio and standing up, "the banks take it all in 17 days anyway. Blackwood Capital operates aggressively, Mr. Sterling. We don't negotiate. You have 48 hours to execute the documents, or we withdraw the offer." As Pierce walked out of the office, Richard stared at the contract. He was a financial advisor. He knew this was a predatory, borderline suicidal agreement, but his arrogance whispered to him. He convinced himself that with the cash injection, he could finish the condos, sell them at a premium, and pay off the loan before the crushing interest buried him. He didn't think about failure. 2 days later, Richard Sterling signed away the legal rights to his entire existence to a phantom corporation, completely unaware that the invisible hands holding the pen were his own parents. Back in New York, Thomas received the executed contract via secure email. He printed it out and laid it on the table next to the original eviction notice Richard had handed him months ago. The symmetry was beautiful. He took the bait, Thomas told Margaret, pouring 2 glasses of an impossibly rare vintage of Bordeaux. Now, Margaret said, her eyes flashing with a predatory gleam, "We break his legs." Over the next 4 months, Blackwood Capital did not just sit back and wait to collect interest. Using their virtually unlimited resources, Thomas and Margaret systematically sabotaged Richard's recovery from the shadows. When Richard tried to secure the necessary steel shipments for the Brookline framework, he found that a mysterious private buyer had outbid him, buying up the regional supply chain and forcing him to import from overseas at triple the cost. When Richard attempted to rush the updated environmental zoning permits through the city council, a highly funded, aggressive local lobbying group suddenly materialized, suing the city over the ecological impact of the condos. The injunction stalled construction for another 90 days. Every time Richard tried to move forward, he hit an invisible, impenetrable wall. The delays burned through his $40 million lifeline at a terrifying speed. He was paying contractors to stand around a muddy pit. The 19% interest on the Blackwood loan began compounding, turning his debt into a monstrous, unpayable singularity. By the end of the 6th month, the money was gone. The Brookline site was dead. And the first catastrophic balloon payment to Blackwood Capital Partners was officially 48 hours overdue. In his New York penthouse, Thomas picked up a secure phone and dialed Gregory Pierce. "Mr. Pierce," Thomas said, his voice as cold as the Adirondack snow, "execute the default clauses. Liquidate his firm. Foreclose on the Weston property. Leave him with absolutely nothing." The collapse of Richard Sterling's empire did not happen in slow motion. It was a sudden, violent implosion that left no survivors. At 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 48 hours after the default clause was triggered, a fleet of black SUVs pulled up to the glass-fronted headquarters of Sterling Wealth Management. Gregory Pierce, flanked by 4 federal marshals and a team of forensic accountants, walked through the revolving doors with a stack of court-ordered injunctions. Richard was in the middle of a frantic, screaming phone call with a concrete supplier when the double doors to his corner office swung open. "Mr. Sterling," Pierce said, his voice carrying the chilling, hollow echo of an executioner. "As the legal representative of Blackwood Capital Partners, I am executing the Uniform Commercial Code liens placed upon this firm. You are currently in breach of contract, having defaulted on the $40 million mezzanine loan. Your assets are now frozen. Your firm is hereby in receivership." Richard dropped the phone. His face drained of color, taking on the waxy hue of a corpse. "Pierce, wait. Pierce, listen to me. I just need another 30 days. I have a buyer lined up for the commercial parcel in Cambridge. I can restructure the debt. You can't just seize the company." The time for restructuring passed at midnight on Sunday. Pierce replied smoothly, snapping his fingers. 2 accountants immediately moved to Richard's computer, pulling the hard drives. Furthermore, the cross-collateralization clauses tied to your personal assets have been activated. The bank holding the primary mortgage on your Weston property has been notified of your insolvency. They are accelerating the note. "My house?" Richard's voice cracked, a pathetic, high-pitched sound. "You're taking my house?" "We are taking everything, Mr. Sterling. You have 10 minutes to collect any personal, non-company purchased items and vacate the premises. Security will escort you out." The humiliation was absolute. Richard, who had spent his entire adult life cultivating an image of untouchable financial supremacy, was paraded through the bullpen of his own firm carrying a cardboard box, holding a framed degree and a customized putter. His employees, the people he had bullied and micromanaged for years, watched him go in stunned, silent satisfaction. But the nightmare was only beginning. When Richard's Uber, because his leased Mercedes G-Wagon had already been immobilized by the firm's fleet manager, pulled up to the gates of his sprawling, 12,000 square foot estate in Weston, he found a moving truck parked in the circular driveway. Beatrice was standing in the foyer screaming at 2 movers who were carrying a massive, antique Venetian mirror out the front door. She turned as Richard walked in, her face twisted in a mask of pure venom. "Your credit cards are declining," she spat, not bothering with a greeting. "The country club called me this morning to say our membership has been suspended due to insufficient funds, and then my lawyer called to tell me the house is being seized by a shadow corporation. What did you do? Richard. Thea, I can fix this, Richard begged, reaching out for her. It's a temporary liquidity freeze. A hostile takeover attempt. I just need to get my attorneys on it. Your attorneys dropped you an hour ago because your retainer bounced. Beatrice interrupted, stepping back as if his failure was contagious. You leveraged my life, Richard. You bet everything on that stupid hole in the ground in Brookline. I am not going down with your sinking ship. Where are you going? He pleaded, watching the movers load her designer luggage into the back of a waiting town car. To my sisters in Nantucket. My lawyer is drafting the divorce papers. Do not call me. She walked out the door without looking back, leaving Richard entirely alone in a cavernous, empty house that no longer belonged to him. For 3 days, Richard lived in a state of alcohol-fueled delirium. He drank his way through the remains of his top-shelf scotch collection, pacing the empty hardwood floors as the reality of his ruin settled into his bones. He called every contact he had ever made, Ivy League classmates, golf buddies, old mentors. No one picked up. In the ruthless world of high finance, a man who loses $40 million overnight is a pariah. He was mathematically and socially dead. On the fourth morning, a courier knocked on the front door, handing Richard a thick envelope. Inside was a formal summons from Blackwood Capital Partners. Mr. Sterling, a final settlement conference regarding the liquidation of your estate has been scheduled for 3 p.m. today. The meeting will take place on the top floor of the Brookline development site. Failure to appear will result in the immediate auction of your remaining personal effects. Blackwood Capital is prepared to offer a nominal relocation stipend upon the signing of the final surrender documents. Richard stared at the paper. A relocation stipend. It was a humiliating scrap thrown to a starving dog, but he had exactly $42 left in his personal checking account. He had no choice. The Brookline site was a graveyard of ambition. The massive excavation pit was filled with muddy rainwater, and the half-finished steel skeleton of the luxury condos loomed against the gray April sky like the ribs of a rotting carcass. A temporary weatherproof construction office trailer sat precariously on the edge of the lot. Richard trudged through the mud, his once immaculate Italian leather shoes ruined. He looked like a broken man. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes were bloodshot, and he hadn't shaved in days. He walked up the aluminum steps of the trailer and pushed the heavy metal door open. The inside of the trailer had been bizarrely transformed. The cheap folding tables and blueprints were gone. In the center of the room sat a massive, polished oak dining table, a replica of the very one Richard had grown up eating at. Sitting at the head of the table, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that commanded the room, was an elderly man. Beside him, radiating a quiet, terrifying elegance in a navy silk blouse, was an elderly woman. Richard stopped dead in his tracks, the breath hitched in his throat, his mind fractured, unable to process the visual information. Mom? Dad? He whispered, his voice trembling. Thomas Sterling did not smile. He did not stand up to greet his son. He simply leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over the polished oak. Hello, Richard. Have a seat. Richard's eyes darted around the room, looking for Gregory Pierce, looking for the phantom executives of Blackwood Capital. What are you doing here? Did they foreclose on you too? Did Pierce bring you here? Mr. Pierce is our employee, Richard, Margaret said, her voice smooth and devoid of the maternal warmth that had defined her for 70 years. He answers to us. We are Blackwood Capital Partners. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a diamond. Richard collapsed into the cheap plastic chair opposite them, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. That's impossible, Richard stammered, shaking his head violently. I evicted you. I gave you $5,000. You went to a state-run facility. You don't have $40 million. You don't have a shadow corporation. We never went to Whispering Pines, Thomas said slowly, letting every word twist the knife. When you threw us out of our home to fund this muddy pit we're sitting above, we drove north. To a property your mother inherited from her great-uncle, Theodore Ashford. You remember Theodore, don't you? The man your grandfather ruined? Richard knew the family history. He knew the rumors of the lost Ashford fortune. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He left it all locked in a vault. Richard, Margaret continued. Her eyes locked onto her son's pale face. Hundreds of millions of dollars in untraceable, mature bearer bonds and gold bullion. Waiting for us. Waiting for the exact moment you decided we were no longer useful to you. Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. The panic, The confusion and the sheer impossibility of the situation boiled over into a sudden, desperate rage. You did this to me? You destroyed my firm? You bought out the steel suppliers? You funded the environmental lawsuits? You gave me that predatory loan knowing I would default? We didn't force you to sign a suicidal contract, Thomas corrected coldly. Your arrogance did that. We simply provided the rope. You were so desperate to save your ego, so eager to build your little empire on the ashes of our lives, that you didn't even read the fine print. You leveraged your entire existence because you thought you were smarter than everyone else. I am your son, Richard screamed, tears of frustration and terror finally spilling over his cheeks. You deliberately ruined my life. You took my company. Beatrice left me. I have nothing. You had a mother and a father who loved you, Margaret said, her voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. We gave you everything. We paid for your education. We funded your first business. We trusted you when you stood in a hospital room and told a man recovering from a stroke that he needed to sign over his deed for his own protection. And how did you repay us? You threw us into a blizzard with a $5,000 check and told us not to take the light fixtures. Thomas reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a crisp white envelope and slid it across the oak table. It stopped inches from Richard's trembling hands. What is this? Richard choked out. It's the relocation stipend outlined in your summons, Thomas said, his face carved from stone. It is a cashier's check for exactly $5,000 and a brochure for a very practical, state-subsidized men's shelter in South Boston. I hear the state subsidies cover most of the cost. It's practical. Richard stared at the envelope. The absolute perfect symmetry of his destruction shattered the last remaining pieces of his sanity. He began to sob, a pathetic, broken sound that echoed off the thin aluminum walls of the trailer. He reached out, his fingers hovering over the envelope, realizing that this was all he had left in the world. We are keeping the Weston house, Margaret added casually, standing up and smoothing her silk blouse. The architecture is a bit modern for my taste, but the gardens are lovely. And as for this site, Thomas, what did the architects say? They said once we clear out the rotting steel, it will make a beautiful, public botanical garden. Thomas replied, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. A nice place for the community. Thomas and Margaret walked toward the door. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. They had survived the freezing dark, they had cracked the iron vault, and they had extracted their pound of flesh. Dad, wait! Richard cried out, half rising from his chair, clutching the $5,000 check like a lifeline. Please! You can't just leave me like this! Where am I supposed to go? Thomas paused with his hand on the doorknob. He looked over his shoulder, his eyes meeting the terrified, broken gaze of the man who used to be his son. It's a big world, Richard Thomas said quietly. I suggest you buy a warm coat. He opened the door, and the elderly couple stepped out into the crisp, bright April afternoon, leaving Richard Sterling completely alone in the ruins of the empire he had tried to build on their graves. In the end, the story of Thomas and Margaret Sterling became a dark, whispered legend in the upper echelons of Boston's financial district, a chilling cautionary tale about the absolute, destructive limits of greed and the terrifying patience of the betrayed. They did not allow the sudden, massive influx of the Ashford fortune to corrupt their souls, nor did they squander it on shallow luxuries. Instead, they used it as an instrument of precise, karmic justice. Richard's ruthless ambition had frozen his heart long before he ever cast his parents out into the snow, and in their devastating reprisal, they simply forced him to live in the cold wasteland he had created. As the Blackwood Botanical Gardens bloomed over the excavated ruins of their stolen home, Thomas and Margaret finally found their peace, proving that while blood may be thicker than water, ice will always shatter them both,